but very cool. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that makes sense. We're going to spend a bit of time here, and actually it's something we're going to touch on a lot as we get into practical beekeeping and the like, that there's a lot of energy spent by bees making sure that other bees and hornets and pests don't come into the hive. And Western honeybees regulate that, by having just one or two little entrances and putting little guard bees at the outside and making sure that things don't come in and out. But yeah, what do you do if you're Apis dorsata and your hive is just a big stinking exposed comb on the side of a cliff? So yeah, very cool sort of behavioral solution to that problem right there. So yeah, thanks for bringing that to our attention. All right. So last time we wrapped up talking about eusocial reproduction. And if you remember, the idea is that if you're talking about a eusocial species like a honeybee is, we are talking about basically a superorganism, a system where the vast majority of individuals are non-reproductive. They are completely incapable of reproducing if they want. And then you have a reproductive queen that could go out and reproduce and create new bee colonies, but she is completely helpless by herself. Many queens do not leave the hive at any point in their lifetime except to establish a new hive, so they stay in one place. They get attended by worker bees there all the time, and so they can't just go out and do their own thing. Consequently, when we talk about honeybee reproduction, we're not so much talking about the reproduction of individual bees or even of individual queens. We're talking about the entire hive dividing itself and reestablishing itself somewhere else. So, as far as eusocial reproduction is concerned, we wrapped up with annual life cycle. So just as a review, these are the more primitive versions of eusocial society as we know it. In this case, the idea is that all the workers, all the drones, everybody except for the mated queen die off during the winter time. So basically, you have a fertilized queen during the winter time. She goes off and finds some sheltered place to overwinter, usually in a hole in the ground or some loose bark on a tree, just somewhere a little bit sheltered. In the springtime, she comes out. She will find a nest to establish herself in. She'll lay a bunch of unfertilized eggs, or a bunch of eggs that eventually become her workers, and they help her. During the fall, she'll lay a bunch of drone eggs, unfertilized eggs, and she'll lay one last round of female brood, and they will hatch and become queens. The drones and the queens will mate, the queens will fly out to go over winter, everybody else, including the old queen, will stay in the hive and die during the winter time, and the whole cycle will start itself back up again. And this is what we see in bumblebees, yellow jackets, paper hornets. This is just sort of a visual version of that with bumblebees. So we got a bumblebee queen overwintering in a hole. She goes out and finds a new nest site. Here she's laying some eggs and she's establishing little honey pots. So bumblebees keep hives. They tend to be in like old mouse holes in the ground. And if you look at them, they'll have a bunch of little round wax pitchers laying around all over the place. And those are full of honey. When the brood hatch, basically they feed off of the honey. We have the population grow and grow until she produces some drones. Everybody dies. And then the fertilized queens leave. Now with honeybees, we're dealing with a more advanced version of eusocial reproduction, and that is a perennial life cycle. This would be eusocial insects that maintain workers all year round. So they don't go through some annual die-off period, or at least not a total die-off, like we see in, say, bumblebees. In this case, basically, the queen is always maintaining workers, just the population tends to decline during the unfavorable season. So during the winter, they produce less workers, so that when the workers die off, they aren't replacing them one for one, and the population decreases. Similarly, instead of producing males and new queens at a specific time of year, say fall, so that you can have fertilized queens in the winter, instead, they produce new queens and males during seasons when resources are most abundant. So when there's lots of resources available, and the hive reasons, we can afford to produce a whole bunch of extra people, a whole bunch of extra bees. We can afford to lose some of the hive to a big split. So let's, invest in that right now. And this is what we see with apis, with the ants, with the other stingless bees. So consequently, when we talk about honeybees, the major form of hive reproduction is something that we call swarming. So basically, swarming starts with a nectar flow. So you're in a situation where you have a whole bunch of resources available to you. There's more nectar coming into the hive. Now, of course, I just left it out. Then the bees know what to do with. So they're putting away lots of honey, lots of pollen, and they're also developing lots and lots of brood. During this period, the workers will lay a bunch of eggs, the queen will lay a bunch of eggs that are going to become new queens. So she lays a bunch of queen's eggs, and while they are developing, the workers will stop feeding the queen. By not feeding her, she's going to lighten up, she's going to be capable of flight again, and can leave the hive. And then just before the new queens hatch, the old queen is going to fly out of the hive, and she's going to take a little over half of the workers with her, about 60% of them are going to fly out of the hive with the old queen, and they're going to go establish a new nest somewhere else. This is the swarm that you see. Has anyone just seen a bee swarm, like out and about in the wild? Yeah, some people, right? It's just a big bundle of bees. Basically, what you're looking at is the old queen from another hive in the middle of a big bundle of workers that are there to take care of her and protect her. Shortly after the old queen leaves, the new queens hatch. Typically, a bunch of queens hatch. They fly out of the hive. They look for drones that are buzzing around. They'll mate with the drones, come back to the hive, and establish themselves as the queen. Typically, the first queen that mates and gets back gets to become the queen. All the other ones get rejected and die, essentially. So yeah, then ultimately after that all happens, all the extra reproductives, the drones and the queens will be killed off.
Is there like a time period that you can determine and catch the old queen of the 60% of the workers to establish a new colony for yourself?
Yes. So that's a big thing in beekeeping, is figuring out when are your hives likely to swarm and then stopping it from happening in the first place.
That's doable.
Yes. So typically what you would do, as best I know, is you would want to, you can sort of tell when bees are starting to get agitated, and you also know when the major nectar flows are. So if you're going to put a bunch of bees out in an almond orchard, and they're going to be picking up, nectar like crazy, you can assume that stronger hives might swarm during that period. So maybe right before you put them out, what you can do is sort of divide the hives. So you take, like half of your frames from one hive, put them in a new hive, and then put a new queen in there. And you can purchase queens, and they'll be socialized to that hive, and they'll just take over. So you create like an artificial swarming event. And then you got 2 hives instead of 1.
What's the cost of producing a queen? Say, I know they might be in the bundle.
A while back I was looking at them, I think they were like $20, $30.
Yeah, there's a real range. Some queens could be as cheap as like $8, $10. Some of them are going to be $20, $30. Part of it's going to be the genetics you're going to get. So when a queen mates, I mentioned the queen goes out and mates with drones. That's plural. Ideally, a queen is going to mate with several dozen drones so that she has a really diverse sperm in her spermatheca. If you remember, insects, right, they store sperm in their spermatheca. And then when the eggs come out, they fertilize them as the eggs are being pushed out through the birth canal. And so, bees want to have a really diverse population of sperm so that their hive population is diverse and they don't end up with genetic weaknesses. So these queens are out there mating with a lot. And so if you buy more expensive queens, the general assumption is they've been mated with a lot of drones and you're getting a good genetic reserve. Whereas if you're buying a cheap queen, maybe it's not quite so well mated. So here's just some images of the process. So up here we see, right there, that's one of the special queen cells. So queen cells are sort of cup-shaped and they hang off the side of the comb and point downwards. So they are very obvious if you start pulling out your frames and you see a bunch of queen cells. That's definitely definite sign that your hive is thinking of swarming. So what a lot of keepers will do is they'll scrape those off if they see them to discourage them from actually swarming. Here we have, that turned out pretty dark, but that's a queen and a drone. They mate while flying. So you'll sort of see a whole bunch of bees bumping into each other in the air. Sometimes you go out in the spring, that's usually mating. And then here we have a swarm. So a whole bunch of honeybees all together in a clump, with typically a queen right in the middle. And what they're doing is basically the queen will leave with her workers, they'll go establish themselves somewhere, and they're just going to wait there while a bunch of scouts go out and look for a good nesting site. So they're just hanging out waiting to hear from the scouts. Eventually some of the scouts will come back and basically communicate to the swarm, we found the place, and they will follow the scout back, and they'll sort of set up a pheromone plume that the bees can home in on. Question?
Just to be clear, this is just a sign. This is just something going on for in the honeybees, right? It's not every bee swarms.
That's a good point. Yeah, I believe, so you're going to see this behavior in some of the other social insects. There are some like ants and termites that may swarm a little, but generally with those, what you'll see is a queen will mate, fly out, and swarm an entire colony by herself. So this is mostly just honeybees, as far as swarming is concerned. But let me look into that. Oh, and I only included this picture because if you Google honeybee life cycle, it does come up. So, kind of make you smile. I'll pop that in there. And this was the last thing, something interesting the book brought up, which is we only see eusociality in hymenoptera and the isoptera, right? The termites. Those are the only two groups where we see sociality. So it kind of got people thinking, why has eusociality evolved in hymenoptera? And the evidence suggests that eusociality has evolved multiple times within hymenoptera. It's not like there was one group of hymenoptera that suddenly became social and everybody else branched off of that. It looks like there have been multiple groups that have discovered eusociality separately. So there's kind of this general question, why are hymenoptera so good at it? And there's a lot of speculation. Some of the major reasons that I found were the idea that they are general food feeders, meaning that they don't have super specialized food sources. Generally, they eat nectar and pollen, or if you're ants, you eat everything. Similar with wasps, you eat other insects. So there's almost always food nearby. So you can afford to invest in a big colony because generally you can assume you're going to find food no matter what. They also have a means of defense. Stinging bees have stingers. Ants have oftentimes chemical defense or painful bites. So they actually have the ability to protect their stored food, which many insects do not. Cockroaches don't have the ability to, inflict pain upon people who intrude upon them. So maybe we don't have very social cockroaches, or at least not eusocial ones. They have food transmission behavior. Most hymenoptera have the ability to swap food between individuals by regurgitating some of it and sharing it, so that weaker members of a colony can be supported by stronger ones, and also so that members of the colony that don't go out hunting for food can still survive. The young and adults tend to eat the same thing, so you don't need to deal with having different life stages of food, the ability to store food, the ability to evolve caste differentiation, that they can have workers and queens, and also the ability to generate and conserve heat. So with that, I wanted to point out that I've said that there are only really eusocial hymenoptera and isoptera. That being said, there are some cases of eusociality in other insects that are very uncommon. There are actually some eusocial aphids that I've discovered. These guys are gall aphids. So basically what they do, right, is they produce a gall on the outside of a leaf by injecting growth hormones into the plant, causing it to grow up over itself. Then the aphids live inside the gall and feed on all the nutrients that seep there. But in this group, there's actually a caste of aphids called soldier aphids, a soldier caste. The soldier caste is sterile and cares for the young, so they are technically a separate caste in a eusocial society. I think it's kind of funny. These soldier aphids have really beefy forelegs. It's kind of like, you know, they will literally. This is a lacewing larvae here. The soldier aphids will literally crawl up on top of predators and bite them, and you know, in some cases will overpower and kill predators to protect the colony. So it's a really unusual sort of insect. Similarly, there are soldier thrips in gall-producing thrips. These are, as best I can tell, are only found in Australia. But here we can see a gall produced by a thrip with the thrip female inside. Here's that gall again, but this time completely filled with thrip larvae. So that's a lot of thrips. And then they have a worker class and a soldier class, which care for young. And so again, you can see the general difference between a worker and a soldier. The soldier's got big, beefy forelegs for protecting offspring.
Is that usually the case for all, like, all of them? I see that all of them. Last one had beefy shoulders too.
It did. It seems to be the case for these aphids and thrips. That the soldier casts are generally, I got big, beefy forearms. You'll see with like ants, right? Ants have soldier casts sometimes, and typically the ants will have like great big heads with strong musculature. And I don't know if they have big, beefy forelegs or anything. I don't think so, because they're more invested in biting. These guys, basically what they'll do is they've got these big forelegs because they'll crawl up on the predator, they'll wrap their forelegs around them, and then just bite them over and over again. And so I think the big forelegs are basically just there to grasp and not let go.
Are their mouthpiece are also slightly modified, stronger, more durable?
I believe that overall, yeah, just about everything up here is a little bit larger and stronger and more durable. So yeah, I think they are set for biting through exoskeleton a little better than a typical thrips would. All right, so any questions about that before we move on? All right, so lecture 4, we're covering honeybee castes and life cycles. So, the main point of this lecture is just to cover the major divisions that occur within the bee hive. So, if you look inside a beehive, what we'll see is that there are an assortment of different kinds of bees, in the sense of there are at least 3 different types of honeybee adults: queens, drones, and workers. And then in addition to that, we have bees in various stages of development: eggs, larval, pupal, and adult stages. And in many ways, understanding the ways in which these 3 castes interact with one another, and then understanding how the development of these bees occurs, is really the meat and potatoes of being a beekeeper. Your job is to make sure that they can successfully transition through all of these stages. And then additionally, what we'll see is with certain castes like the workers, they continue to go through complex behavioral changes in their adult stages. And so understanding how workers transition through these different behaviors, take on different roles within the hive, is helpful in making major decisions around keeping your hives healthy. So, yes. So let's talk about the major castes first, and then we'll jump into reproduction. So, reproductive castes. There are 2 different reproductives in the hive, right? There's the queen and there's the drone. These are both 100% reproductive. They don't really do anything else. They just reproduce. So functionally then, the queen is the only fully developed female in the hive. And she has 2 major jobs. One of them is to regulate colony reproduction. So it's her job to make sure that there are enough eggs in the cells and that the colony stays at a healthy number. And it's also her job to maintain colony cohesion. So the queen has a number of glands that are involved in very complex release of pheromones. And those pheromones basically tell the bees who belongs, who doesn't, when it's time to do various things, how to interact with one another. And basically, you know, they just help the colony stay alive. So functionally, the queen is highly specialized, as I mentioned before, and is incapable of surviving on her own. She is so large that she actually can't feed or groom herself. She has to have attendants come up to her and feed her everything. And she's completely incapable of even leaving the hive, except for during a swarm. And as I just mentioned before, the only time that these guys can even leave is because they haven't been fed for a while, and they've been starved down to a smaller size that's capable of flight. That being said, a fun fact that I just learned is that queens are not even able to excrete by themselves. So honeybees don't poop in their own hive. That's really unclean. Honeybees will leave the hive and either poop over the edge or they'll fly out and poop and come back. Queens will literally poop on worker bees and have them carry it out of the hive for them. So it's good to be queen. So functionally, when we're looking at a hive, a queen is going to look a lot like a worker bee. Here we have a queen right here, surrounded by workers. And the only real way we can tell the difference between the queen and the worker is that she's a little bit larger, and she has a much longer abdomen. And here we see actually a queen in the process of laying eggs. So we have a bunch of cells, and inside the cells you can see those little tiny eggs down at the bottom. This is basically the majority of her work. She goes through the hive and she deposits eggs. During their peak reproductive time, queens can actually lay as many as 1,500 eggs a day, which is sort of equivalent to the queen laying her own body weight in eggs. So these guys are really just master reproducers. So here's a picture that shows the size difference a little bit better. So here you can see the queen is substantially larger than the workers are. In general, if you're looking at a hive, there will only ever be one queen. Bees don't mess around with having multiple reproductives. Generally, the only time you will find the only time you'll find two is there may be a short overlap of a mother and daughter during a swarming event. Let's say the queen is not quite ready to swarm, but some of the new queens have already hatched. So you might see some young queens then that are pre-reproductive before the mother queen leaves, but that's unusual.
Let's suppose the queen lays X amounts of eggs. What percentage of those eggs tend to be female compared to those female?
The vast majority. So all of the workers are female. So if you look at a beehive, you'll have one queen, you'll have somewhere between like 10 and 60,000 workers, and you'll have maybe a couple hundred drones at most. So the vast majority of the hive is female, even at their lowest numbers. And males are basically just sort of tolerated in the hive because they're needed for reproduction. But yeah. Cool. So in general, most hives will maintain their queen for at least 2 years. There are some cases where queens will die before that, where you might only get a queen for 1 year, and that's generally if you're having issues with pests in the hive, pesticide exposure, maybe mites, that if you have problems like that, the queens will degrade quickly, and you'll have to requeen more frequently. So drones. Drones are the male members of the reproductive caste, right? And their only purpose is reproduction. They don't do diddly. Other than reproduce. Well, they do diddly, but they don't do anything else. So they only diddly. They are really, really useless, which makes them kind of interesting to look at. So their only purpose is reproduction. You can tell a drone apart from workers and queens pretty easily because they tend to be large. They are larger than workers, slightly smaller than queens, and they have this really big, beefy, barrel-shaped body. So big, a really big thorax, large abdomen, and their eyes are really big. So if you look at this guy, you'll see that his eyes meet at the top of his head, which is unusual. If you look at these workers, they've got distinct eyes set on the sides of their head, but nothing on the top. Same thing with the queen, nothing on the top. And so here again, we see a bunch of workers standing next to a drone. So you can see the drone is pretty big. It's It's got those unusual eyes. If you think about it, the drones have half the chromosomes that everybody else has because they're haplodiploid. So, you know, they're operating on a few less genes than the queens and the workers are. So, got to cut the drones some slack. Which brings me to my main point. So we talked about this in entomology, but as a refresher, more or less all hymenoptera practice a reproductive system that's really unusual. It's called Haplodiploidy. So just as a review, right? When a mommy and a daddy decide that they want to make a baby, right? There's a sperm, right? And there's an egg. And the idea is that, you know, more or less all insects and all people are, you know, diploid, meaning we have 2 copies of every single chromosome. You inherit, right? So 1, 2. And when a male and a female go to make a baby, basically the baby receives 1 copy of a chromosome from the mother, 1 copy from the father, to make a baby that is diploid. So that half of your genes come from your mother, half of them come from your father. This is the case with insects too. The vast majority of insects reproduce sexually and transmit 1 copy of genes through the sperm, 1 copy through the eggs. But in bees and in other hymenoptera, we have this unusual system where it's actually a mix of sexual reproduction and parthenogenic reproduction. Anyone remember what parthenogenic reproduction is?
Self-birth, right?
Exactly, self-birth. It's basically where the insect is a female insect is able to lay an unfertilized egg that will turn into a genetic clone of the mother. So basically, they don't need any sperm to reproduce.
Like an aphid, perhaps?
Yes, just like an aphid. Aphids are a unique case because they give live birth to their clones, but it is parthenogenesis. But yeah, so basically in bees, the real key here is that the sex of the offspring is determined by egg fertilization. That's the takeaway here. That the queen can control whether her offspring are going to be male or female by fertilizing the egg or not fertilizing it. It's sort of something that she has the ability to control. So unfertilized eggs are haploid, meaning that the queen basically gives 1 copy of every chromosome, and they are her copies, the ones she puts in the egg. And those will develop into the drones. Eggs that are fertilized with the sperm have 2 copies, they're diploid, and they will become female bees. And those can become workers or queens. So that's the big takeaway here. So just to visualize that, what we have here is just sort of a simple split. We have a queen bee, and this circle just represents the queen bee. In the queen, she has 2 copies of every chromosome because she is diploid. When the queen produces an egg, all of her eggs are haploid. They only have 1 chromosome. If she were to lay one of those eggs just by itself, it would go down here and it would become the male drone. But if, as she is giving birth to the egg, she releases a little bit of sperm from the spermatheca, and it fertilizes that egg, you're going to end up with a female worker or a queen, depending on how that egg is treated after it is birthed. And we'll talk about that towards the second half of this lecture. So basically the whole point is, it's all about the number of chromosomes, and it's all about queen choice. Any questions about this before we move on? Cool. So, drones. Like I mentioned before, drones are really useless except for doing it. They don't assist in any hive maintenance. So they don't clean hives, they don't forage, they don't take care of young, they don't do anything. Basically, all drones do is that after they're born, they tend to hang out together on the pollen hive. So it's kind of like going to the bar and sitting around with your buddies. They hang out on the pollen comb, they dig out the pollen, they eat it. You know, they talk smack about the queen or whatever they do. They don't do anything. They just hang out. About 2 to 4 hours a day, they basically fly out of the hive and they search for queens to mate with. The vast majority of them are not successful because there's not a lot of queens buzzing around looking to mate, but there's always drones flying around looking for them. And if a drone does ultimately get to fulfill its purpose in life and mate, it promptly dies right after mating because it basically detaches its entire reproductive system during the mating process. So again, here's a slightly clearer picture of a queen, a female queen and a drone mating in flight, which is typically how it occurs. And what I think is really interesting about drones is that the workers, I think, are resentful of the drones. As much as any insect can be resentful of another insect. I don't know if that's possible. But it is shown that workers keep really close tabs on how many drones there are. And there's been research to show that workers will actually destroy drone eggs that the queen lays if they think there are too many drones roaming around. So they're kind of saying, like, going behind the queen's back, you know, getting rid of stuff. But my favorite thing is that in the autumn time, when it's clear that they are losing their resources and the bees don't think they can afford to keep feeding these drones, and it doesn't look like there's going to be a swarm or anything, all the workers will basically get together and evict the drones. They'll throw them out of the hive and be like, "Get out! We don't want you. We're not gonna feed you. You got to figure yourself out." So that's what's going on here. We got a bunch of workers. They're kind of bullying this drone out of the hive. Actually, this is a nice picture. You can really tell the difference between the drone and the workers just by their eyes. Do you see that? Yeah, right? And so they'll throw them out, and what you'll sometimes find in the autumn is a big pile of dead drones directly outside of the hive, because they'll try and get back in, and the workers will just be like, no, no, no. So that's drones. All right. And then let's talk about what is arguably the most important caste of the honeybees, the workers. The workers are definitely the most numerous bees in the hive. Like I mentioned before, typically you're talking, most hives have anywhere between, on the low end, we're talking about 10,000 all the way up to 60,000 on the high end. Apparently, I can't draw right there in that corner. But either way, point being, you have a lot of workers compared to a single queen and maybe 100 or 200 drones at one time. So a pretty big difference. A fertilized female is workers are all fertilized females, so just like the queen's egg. But the difference is that during their development, they never develop fully formed reproductive organs. So they are incapable of reproducing like a queen is. They tend to be smaller than the queen, and they also tend to lack the ability to produce some of the queen's pheromones. So the queen has a real monopoly on the whole range of pheromone production and the ability to lay eggs. That being said, workers do have a variety of things that the queen does not, and drones do not. Specifically, they have specialized features for hive maintenance. On their legs, they have pollen presses, and pollen baskets, which are basically just structures for carrying pollen back and forth between the hive and forage, or forage and the hive. They have wax glands on their abdomen, which is used to produce the wax that builds beehives. And they also have something called hypopharyngeal glands. These, we're going to touch on all of these later, but the important thing is that hypopharyngeal glands produce royal jelly, which is what is fed to the larva when they first hatch. So basically, these bees are just designed to collect resources, build the hive, and feed the young. And those are features that only the workers have. So before we jump into workers full stop, let's just take a look real quick at the castes that we're looking at. We've got a drone, a queen, and a worker. And so as you can see here, in general, the queen and the worker do look very similar. The major difference we see between the two is just that a queen is going to be larger. Actually, now that I look at this, for those sitting in the back or in the middle, do you have trouble seeing the bottom of the screen over this desk? No, you can see all this? Cool. Whereas you can see with the drone, it's got that, the body really is very barrel-shaped. It's a very robust bee in comparison to the queen and the worker. And right here, we see that this is one of those big pollen loads that they carry on their hind legs. So this would be sort of where the pollen basket is on the bee, but right now it's covered in pollen, so you can't see it. Cool. So let's talk about the roles that worker bees fulfill. Something that's really cool about workers is that workers actually pass through a series of different jobs that they do based on how old they are. So newly hatched workers have certain jobs, middle-aged workers have certain jobs, and old workers have certain jobs. And they progress through them in sort of a sequential process. Consequently, you can sort of predict when you're going to see major behaviors happen in the hive based on how old the hive is. In general, though, we can split these duties between two major groups. You have what we call hive bees, and we have field bees. So hive bees are those that basically work inside the hive. This is where there's a lot of different jobs. Hive bees are house cleaners. They take care of the brood. They ripen the nectar into honey. They are in charge of honey and pollen storage, guarding. There are bees called undertaker bees, which do exactly what you think. They collect dead bees and throw them out of the hive. There's all sorts of jobs inside the hive. On the flip side, older bees tend to be field bees, and their job is foraging. They go out in search of nectar, pollen, and plant resins to make propolis. Now, there's only really one job to do outside the hive, but it takes a lot of bees to forage enough food for the entire hive. So there's typically, more foragers out there. Well, not more foragers, but a lot of foragers out there at any given time. So, let's go through the life cycle and see how bees move between these jobs. So, after a bee emerges as an adult, what we see is a behavior called negative phototastism, or basically the bees are negative phototactic. That means that they're afraid of light, functionally. So when the worker bees first emerge from their cells as adults, they don't like the light, and so they tend to crawl to the middle of the hive, hang out on the pollen combs of the drones, and feed themselves for a little while, building up their strength, just avoiding the outdoors. During this time, they just sort of settle into their first role, which is cleaning. They go around the brood sites, and they clean out the old cells, they remove any waste that's in them, the old beeswax, they repurpose it. They do the same thing for pollen and honey cells, and they also walk around basically learning the hive structure and begging for food from other bees. These bees aren't necessarily capable of feeding themselves very well, and so they basically walk up to workers or those that are transporting things, and they ask for food by sticking their tongue out, and other workers will deposit nectar or honey onto their tongue for them to feed on. Now, during this process, what's happening is their hypopharyngeal glands are maturing, and that's really key. Once their hypopharyngeal glands mature, they are capable of producing royal jelly, which is just a mixture of protein, sugars, fats, vitamins, minerals, and antibiotics. It's basically baby food for bees. They produce this royal jelly, and once they're capable of doing that, workers jump into the first of their extended jobs, which is being nurse bees. And most workers will become nurse bees for around 3 to 11 days. During this time, their job is basically to take care of the larvae. They crawl around to all the cells where there are brood growing. Once the eggs hatch and the larvae emerge, they excrete a whole bunch of royal jelly into the bottom of the cell. And it's actually kind of funny, if you see the pictures, I think we have some better pictures later. In here you can see a cell with a larva curled up in the bottom. Right there, you can see some other larvae around here. But when they're really small, the larvae are literally laying in a puddle of royal jelly. So they're just kind of swimming in their own food source. So they'll put a whole bunch in there, but they also inspect the larvae. They clean them. If they find a dead larva, they pull it out, they throw it outside the hive, and they clean the hive. And they're also in charge of capping the brood. So around about the time that the larvae are about this big, and they're about to go into their pupal stage, they'll put a cap over the top to protect them. And basically, they stay capped until they come out as adults. That's sort of the role of these nurse bees. I should have animated this so we don't have all this information. It's a big slide, so we'll walk through it slowly. I'll point out the main things. So, point of this is that, for the most part, bees will be nurse bees from about day 3 to day 10 or 11. After about that point, their hypopharyngeal glands don't work as well anymore. They're not producing as much royal jelly, and so they will transition into other purposes around the hive. There's any number of purposes that they could fulfill. It really just depends on what the needs of the hive are. If there's a big nectar flow, maybe they're going to become honey ripeners. If it's a really hot, they might become water gatherers or fanners. It's just all about what needs done. But anyway, one of the big jobs is nectar ripening. And basically this is just bees carrying out the process of converting nectar into actual honey, as we know it. So functionally, what the bees are doing is these workers hang out near the entrance of the hive, and they will take a crop of nectar from a field bee. So when field bees are out there sipping nectar from flowers, what they're doing is storing all that nectar inside their crop, which, if you remember, is the last chamber of the insect's foregut. It's got a proventricular valve at the end of it that controls flow into the digestive part. So basically, it's a little storage pouch, and the bees are able to put nectar in there and then regurgitate it at will. So basically, that's how they carry it around. These nectar ripeners basically hang out. When a field bee comes in with a load of nectar, they regurgitate some of it. The worker picks it up, and then they carry it to an isolated part of the nest, usually the topmost part of the nest where there's not a lot of brood activity, and they will regurgitate the nectar into a cell. So they got an empty cell, they put that nectar in there, and then they'll go through a couple of processes to help it mature. The first thing they do is they'll blow a series of bubbles into the nectar. So they just blow air into the nectar. This basically stirs the nectar up. By basically pulling the nectar into their stomach and out, they're introducing yeasts, they're introducing bacteria from the bee's stomach. Those are the things that are going to help break down the sugars and convert it into the formulation of honey. By blowing bubbles into it, they're mixing all those yeasts and bacteria into the nectar, creating a nice homogeneous substance. It also helps evaporate a little bit of it, and it introduces sucrases. Sucrases just being enzymes that break down complex sugars into simple sugars. Once they blow a couple bubbles into it, they continue to mix it by sucking the nectar in and out of their crop for about 20 minutes. So you just sort of sit there and spit it out, suck it in, spit it out, suck it in. And this again just mixes and reincorporates everything they put in it. And at this point, the nectar is considered ripening, and they place that ripening nectar or honey into an empty cell with other ripening honey and allow it to mature. So basically, they just leave it in an open cell where the water is going to evaporate out of it, and it's going to start to sort of, thicken up and get down to just the sugars. Once that honey is considered fully ripened and actually is honey, other bees will pick it up, carry it to storage cells. They'll fill it up to almost the top, and then they'll cap it. And those are your honey cells that you harvest.
So pretty much when we eat honey, like, it's the stuff that they regurgitated for 20 minutes after it ripens.
Yeah, basically. Multiple times. Yeah. So, yeah, it's not the most appetizing thing, but they're very clean. And all considering for insect bees are kind of cute. If you're going to eat anything's vomit. So, just to put some visuals on that. Right here, we have a field bee and a worker bee. This would be the field bee. It looks like it is regurgitating some of the nectar for the worker bee. So this is the process of transferring. And this is actually a field bee, an image of one of them regurgitating. No, I'm sorry, this is actually, regardless, this is a bee regurgitating some honey. It doesn't matter if it's a hive or a field bee. But you can see there's all the honey in its mouth. And then, these are honey cells, right? So we have some empty cells. we see that they are filling cells in, and then these are full cells that have been capped with the nice white beeswax caps. So you can sort of see they started out over here, and they're slowly filling in the cells in this direction. Bees are pretty orderly about how they fill things in.
Do they lay eggs and also start honey in the same cells, or do they have separate cells?
They keep those pretty separate. So what you'll generally find in beehives, as I mentioned before, beehives tend to be vertically organized. So what you'll see in a beehive is that if like these are your frames, right around the very middle of the hive. So I guess let me draw two pictures. I'll do it for the first one. So let's say this is a hive that you're looking at the side, right? So this is a side profile. Here's your frames. This is a hive where you're looking in at the top. So we're like looking down into a beehive. Generally, bees will put their brood in the middle of the hive. So they'll choose the middle of those frames, and right around the middle of those frames, vertically, that's where they're going to put the brood. So the brood tend to concentrate in the middle, near the bottom of the hive. And that's also where they tend to put pollen. So pollen will oftentimes be in the area around the brood, because when the brood hatches, they tend to go to the pollen and feed on that. Whereas honey tends to be concentrated at the top of the hive, which is why we can super to collect honey. So if you put a super on the top of the hive, we can just remove that and be reasonably certain that all that's going to be in there is honey. The other thing people do is some people will put in queen excluders, those little crates that are too small for queens to pass through. They'll put those between the bottom of the hive and your supers. So that way the queens can't even get in there to lay eggs. So there's no chance you're going to get brood development up in your honey.
But they're like the same size though, those cells, pretty much the same size. Kind of.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's possible for them to like lay eggs.
They can. Yeah, so if you have like a really big season and you're full up of brood here, they can move up into the supers and potentially put eggs there. But so oftentimes what people are doing is if it looks like the hive is getting really, really strong, you might just put another bottom box on top to encourage the brood to go into that and then to leave your supers alone.
How long does it take to fill up one of those cells with honey?
I don't know. That's a good question. How long does it take that? I think it's going to depend partially on the amount of forage there is. If there's a lot of forage and a lot of workers bringing nectar in, it probably happens pretty quickly. But if it's a slower season and you don't have a lot of workers, it probably takes a while.
So it's multiple bees working on the same cell, or is it just one cell?
Multiple bees. So it's a whole bunch of bees all participating in this all at the same time, working on multiple cells.
What is the lifespan of a worker bee?
We're going to get to that. We're going to cover that. That's a good question. So, moving on from honey production, another major task that these worker bees are going to be doing is pollen storage. So basically, this is very, very similar to honey production in that you have a worker that hangs out near the entrance. When a forager comes in with a load of pollen on their legs, they retrieve the pollen. They will then combine that pollen with their own saliva, as well as some honey from the hive, and then they will store that in empty cells. When they put, and that's sort of what's going on here. You can see these layers of pollen. And this is a really cool case where the bees have been foraging from a bunch of different flowers, and you can sort of see the waves of bees visiting different flowers. So you have different colors of pollen going on in there. So they fill up the cells with pollen. When the cells are about 3/4 full, what they will do is they'll glaze the top with a little bit of honey. So that's what's going on right here. These are all pollen cells. And you can see on the top they have sort of this yellowish color right here. That's just honey that they've glazed the top of the cell with. And then they just let it sit for a while. And during this time, the pollen is going to ferment, because it's been mixed with saliva. So they've introduced some bacteria, some yeast, and it's going to ferment into something that we call bee bread. And basically, bee bread just partially digests the pollen so that the amino acids, the vitamins, the minerals become much more available to the bees. So it's sort of a way of making a superfood for bees.
So can you actually utilize that, extract out of that, or?
So bee bread is actually a common health food that people sell. So that's what this is right here. This is a bunch of bee breads that someone has shaken out of a bee hive. So you can see they almost look like little, pieces of dog food or something. So you can buy bee bread and eat it. You can also buy pollen from bee hives and consume that. That's sort of a popular health food nowadays. But typically the difference between pollen and bee bread is that when they harvest pollen, what they do is they build what's called a little pollen catcher on the outside of the hive. And what it is basically they restrict the entrance of the hive, so it's pretty small. And when the bees crawl through, there's a high probability that their little pollen, the pollen they've gathered on their legs, will fall off into a little basket on the bottom. And then you just collect that basket. You got a basket full of bee pollen. Whereas bee bread is pollen that's actually been through this whole fermentation process. So, two relatively different products.
Does removing that affect the health of the hive or the bees?
I think what it's going to do is it's going to slow down the hive growth. So naturally, if we left the pollen or the honey untouched in the hive, the colonies would grow faster, they would grow larger, they'd have better survival, and things like that. The trick in beekeeping is you need to know what are your limits. How much can you take while still allowing the hive to survive and to be relatively productive? And where is kind of that nice in-between area where you're taking enough to turn a profit, but not so much that you're, harming your bees. So there's not one answer. That's going to really depend on the environmental conditions. It's going to depend on the health of your hive. So, yeah. All right. Another major task they take is wax secretion and building. So this is between days 12 and 17 of their life. So this is one of the last jobs they tend to take on. During this time, the bees start extracting wax from their wax glands. So basically, on about 3 or 4 of their abdominal segments, on the underside of the bee, they have a couple of glands that secrete wax. And that's what we see right here. So here you can see the segments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And coming out of each of these segments, they have these little scales, they call them, of wax coming out of the bee. So during days 12 to 17, the bees produce a lot of wax from their abdomen. The wax is removed by their mid-legs because they have a special, I think I called it a tarsal spine, but it's actually a tibial spine. There we go. So basically, on their mid-legs, they have a little spine. You can't see it in these pictures. But that spine, they use it to sort of spear the wax, pull it off. They bring the wax up to their mouth and they manipulate it. So they chew it into basically they put some spit into it, sometimes some honey to make it a little bit more pliable. And then they use that to build comb. Generally, in new hives, where they don't have established combs, you're going to have a lot of worker bees doing this. That's going to be a big job that everybody's doing because you need to establish new comb for storage of resources, for production of brood. But in established hives, you're not going to have a whole lot of these. They're going to be basically producing wax to cap things, and they're going to be maybe repairing damaged combs, but you're not going to see a whole lot of wax activity.
Approximately how long does it take to complete the whole comb inside of a beehive?
It's a good question. I don't have a good answer. Hold on. Let's write down these questions I don't have good answers for. So, okay, so how long to build comb? Does anybody else remember the questions I didn't remember previously, or I didn't know before? before. So what I'm going to do from now on is I'm going to keep a running tally. And I'll try and answer them during office hours.
How long does it take for the honey to be fully ripened?
Okay, how long?
Could you actually create a synthetic honeycomb, or if you just have a honeycomb already pre-made, and then you can just allow the hive to just come in and start working on making honey? Or
I think they do to a certain extent. Have you seen those honeybee hives that have that? They're like those self-harvesting honeybee hives where they crack. Anyone seen those?
Are those called the flow hives?
The flow hives, yeah, right? You've seen the flow hives. In the flow hives, basically, they've got artificial cells. So, like, if this is your cell, right? I think the flow hives basically have a plastic cell, but the idea is that there's really minute cracks here, here, and here. And when you want to harvest, what you can do is put like a little crank into the hive and crank it. And what will happen is you'll slide the cells like this so that they come out of alignment. And you'll end up with something like this. So the cells all open up and the honey will flow down like that. And it just sort of all collects in the bottom and flows right out of the hive.
I think they also have pre-drawn plastic frames.
They
encourage.
do. You know what? Let me get something real quick. I have something in my other lab. I have some wax that bees will build on.
Usually they're back pretty fast. I think I got mine like a week, 2 weeks.
What?
Yeah. My last one took me 6 weeks.
Really?
I got mine pretty fast.
So I don't know if they have actual frames that have pre-built wax on them. But what you can do is you can purchase wax wafers, and you would slide these into a frame. And the bees will use this as a template to build the cells on. So if you take a look at that, you can see that it has.
What are those called?
These are called hive wax. What's the proper name? If you search hive wax, you would find them like this. But basically, if you have a frame, you can just slide this right in. It's about the correct size. It actually smells really good. If you smell it, it smells like honey.
What's the price on this?
They're pretty cheap. A pack like this will run you, tens of dollars, and you can, I've got a fair number of them right here. So what a lot of beekeepers do, though, is because they invest a lot of time and energy into building hives, when you harvest your honey, you just take those you take those combs that exist already, you set them out somewhere, and you let the bees rob them. So the bees come in, they take all the extra honey out of them, and then you would take your now empty combs, you just put them back in the hive. And then I'll take those whenever you're done. Thank you. But then you can put the empty combs back in, and that way the bees don't have to invest a whole bunch of time and energy into building new combs. They can just use the old ones. And there's a bit of a debate amongst beekeepers whether that's a good idea or not. Because the idea is that pesticides will slowly accumulate in the wax in your hive. And so some people believe that if you use old wax that's been there for seasons and seasons and seasons, you're going to get higher and higher buildups of pesticides. If Because as you may recall, pesticides generally are lipophilic. They like to hang out in fats, and waxes are nothing but highly refined fats. So, but some beekeepers are firmly of the opinion that, you know, there's not significant enough pesticide buildup in the wax to do any damage to bees. So that's sort of a big debate right now. But yeah, so that's a big job they will do. Did I miss any questions? I've got how long to ripen honey, how long to build comb. I know there was something else and I've already forgotten it. That's why I wrote some stuff down. All right, other jobs. And these are all just these are somewhat less important jobs, so I'll just give very short descriptions of them. But at any given time, there are queen attendants. Their job is to basically clean and feed the queen and remove her waste from the hive. So, important job, undertaker bees, which basically scout the hive for dead or dying bees and remove them. That's why you'll see little piles of dead bees outside the hive. There are air circulators. So air circulators basically will stand at the entrances of the hive and on the comb stuff, and they'll fan their wings in order to cause the air to flow out. There are drone feeders who basically provide food for lazy drones who can't even be bothered to get pollen out of the combs for themselves.
That's why they keep it up.
Exactly. A lot of resentment is what I'm saying. Propolisers, or propolizing bees. Their job is basically to make propolis and walk around the hive, sealing cracks. Oftentimes they'll line the walls with propolis. Propolis has antibacterial properties, so it keeps bacteria outbreaks from occurring. All right. And then right around 18 days, so 18 days is an important age, that's when the bees start to switch from being negatively phototactic to positively phototactic, meaning that they become attracted to light. And this is when the bees start to transition from being hive bees to being field bees. During this period, they'll take on some new roles. They will oftentimes start becoming guard bees, so they will stand near the entrance and make sure that predators and pests and bees from other hives, that we call robbers, don't come in. They'll also become water carriers. So water carriers basically, on hot days, they fly out and collect water. They bring it back to the hive, and they'll deposit it on the back of the air circulating bees. And the idea is that that will cool those bees down. It'll also cause evaporation, which cools the hive through evapotranspiration, like a swamp cooler cools down the house. So bees have like a really primitive air conditioning system. So just wanted to show some pictures of some bees fanning. There we go. So here we see a bunch of fake bees near the entrance fanning their wings. You'll see bees fanning to cool the hive, but also bees will fan to spread pheromones throughout the hive. So if like someone's invading the hive, they'll put their abdomens up in the air and they'll release alarm pheromones that fan their wings to spread that around. And a couple other things. Here's a couple guard bees that are trying to stop this robber bee from getting into the hive. We have an undertaker bee here carrying a dead bee. Dead bees tend to curl up, so you can tell that's the dead bee. And here are some bees at a fountain gathering water for cooling the hive or for just having water. And so with that, this is the general overview of their life cycles. So in the first 1 to 2 days, they tend to be cleaners. And then as their hypopharyngeal glands develop, the majority of hive bees will become nurses, taking care of offspring. After that, they enter a period where they perform any number of jobs for about from days 12 to 21. And then around days 18 to 21, they will start doing sort of semi-outdoorsy jobs. They're not full-blown foragers, but they're out there roaming around. All right, and then we'll jump into field bees on Thursday.
I remember a question you asked me. How long is the lifespan of the worker?
Yeah, so I thought we would get to that, but here's the answer right here. Typical lifespan from when they're laid as an egg to when they die, somewhere between 50 and 60 days. That's pretty typical. That being said, if you are a worker bee that is born in, say, the autumn and you're going into the winter time where you're not foraging, those worker bees can live for as long as 6 months. So basically, worker bees work themselves to death. They work and work and work until they die. So if there's not very much work, they can live for a much longer period of time. All right.
You trying to get?
So I'll look into these and see all of you on Thursday.